something ought to pop up, and I will go into program.
But he never had such trouble.
So I know it's a little slow in coming up. I apologize for a slow internet connection, but you should in a minute see the full screen PowerPoint presentation. I'm trying to get there. And let me again just back up and apologize for the delay. Like I say, like all of us, I've been in Zoom meetings daily forever, and I've never had the runaround trying to get in that I did this time. So I'm not sure why. I very much apologize. And now if you'll bear with me, I'll start talking. I'll start my program.
We're very happy to have you here.
Thanks. I call this Reflections on Birds and Birding in the Antelope Valley. My wife and I moved over the hill, so I am over the hill from Tujunga early in 2019, and so we now live on the slopes of the southern end of the Antelope Valley and have been birding in the Antelope Valley since the early 1970s. So I am over the hill. I am over on this side of the hill. I'm also over the hill in the figurative sense, which means that I can give a talk entitled Reflections, because I'm old enough to reflect on changes in bird life and so on in the Antelope Valley. So this is going to be a bit of a, I hate to say disjointed, but just some thoughts in some ways almost random on the biogeography of birds in the Antelope Valley, the habitats, the conservation issues and other things. So I will, is everybody seeing the slides okay?
Yes.
You should be looking at
It looks
a
good.
Google Earth image of the Antelope Valley. Okay. So the Antelope Valley, as you know, is that triangle there. It's the westernmost extension of the Mojave Desert. And it's a great contrast to the habitats that you would find in the mountains to the south and to the northwest, and of course on the coastal slope over the mountains. And so and if you drew a line about midway, east-west line about midway through that triangle, you'd be drawing the separation between Los Angeles and Kern counties. There's some fascinating information about the birds of the Kern County portion of the western Mojave Desert, but I'm going to restrict most of my thoughts today and discussion to the Los Angeles County side, since I start becoming sort of a quivering mess when I approach the county line and don't do well going into foreign counties. So I'm going to talk mostly about Los Angeles. So again, this is the Antelope Valley. It's basically the Mojave Desert with a variety of habitats, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those. Of course, famous for the poppy fields. This year you would never know it, but last year it was beautiful, and many other years the poppy fields are beautiful. They are adjoined by fields full of solar panels, fields full of houses, and so on, but you can't deny the beauty of the poppies that are on much of at least the western flanks of the Antelope Valley. It's probably the thing that makes it most famous for the people on the other side of the mountains. Much of the Antelope Valley is dominated by creosote scrub. As you can see, the creosote in the foreground with one spindly Joshua tree, and in the background working its way up this butte, and this is in the eastern Antelope Valley. And it's in the springtime when the gold fields and other wildflowers are blooming, and so this is one of the dominant habitats in the Antelope Valley. Joshua tree woodland, of course, a unique and famous habitat, both on the floor of the Antelope Valley and up on some of the slopes to the south and to the north. As you know, with concerns about, with climate change rapidly advancing, there's a lot of concerns about the survival and reproduction of Joshua trees, especially at lower elevations. So some of the higher elevation Joshua tree forests may ultimately be pretty much all we have left, but unique birds of the Joshua trees, and it merges from there up into montane woodlands and so on. So a beautiful habitat. This is the juniper woodland in our neighborhood in Juniper Hills in the pear blossom area, the sort of the southwestern Antelope Valley, and just one area that's dominated by junipers, and that mostly grows from about 3,000 to 4,000 feet on the southern flanks of the Antelope Valley, with some growing a little lower. So again, you get different birds here, and even get some of the chaparral type birds like California scrub jays and California towhees that you wouldn't expect out on the floor of the valley. Much of what interests birders in the Antelope Valley is the green areas. And most of these are essentially artificial. So you can see in the Google Earth image above some agriculture. That's probably an alfalfa field, or it could be some other kind of forage that's being grown. You see various kinds of agriculture. And then that square more toward the left is an area that might be familiar to some of you who bird the Antelope Valley. That's the Rancho Sierra Golf Course on Avenue 60th, the 60th Street East between Avenue F and G. If you've ever birded it, it can be a nice trap for migrants, but do bear in mind you need to check in at the clubhouse and bird only the perimeter and not bird on the fairway. So it's nice of them to let birders do the perimeter, but you can't go in except with very special permission for something like a Christmas count. But these patches of green are traps for migrants. The agriculture has had a important and unique set of birds. The bottom image is that Rancho Sierra Golf Course looking west from an area just east of it. So you can see how it's an oasis of trees and why it would attract migrant birds and a nice variety of birds. And perhaps the most famous single birding locality in the Antelope Valley is the Paiute Pond complex on the Edwards Air Force Base. This is available to birders by permission only. You have to get a pass, either a daily or an annual pass. And in fact, they're instituting new measures where you actually have to take a safety course now before you can even go in. So it's getting a little harder and harder to bird, but the Air Force Base staff has been wonderful, both about managing and improving the habitat and about allowing access to birders. But do recall, you have to have permission to get in. This is one of the major birding hotspots in Los Angeles County, with over 300 bird species recorded. Over 6,000 checklists have been entered in eBird, and it's had some of the most amazing bird rarities, primarily shorebirds, but it's also very good land bird habitat. So again, many of you are familiar with Paiute Ponds from your own birding there, if you have a pass, or from field trips and so on. And just to back up a little, it's kind of interesting, again, being an old timer, that some birding friends of ours in the early to mid 1970s just stumbled into this back when it wasn't even fenced off, and there was really no patrolling or anything. I know Fred Heath and Tom Frillman just said, did you know about this incredible marsh out in the middle of the desert in the Antelope Valley by the base? And none of us knew about it. My first eBird checklist from the Paiute Ponds were entered for 1978, although I had been there before that. And there was a whole spate of rare shorebirds seen in the late 70s and early 80s, and that continues to today. So again, access has gotten much more formal and a little more difficult, but it's been a prime birding locality now for well over 40 years. So famous birding spot. Nice place to see something like white-faced ibis, which you will see sometimes at other wetlands in the Antelope Valley, sometimes in the agricultural fields, but Paiute Ponds is one of the most reliable places to see this species anywhere in Los Angeles County. I should just mention that all of these photos are mine, which means a lot of them aren't that good, but it was a lot easier than having to go beg photos from others, so bear with me. All right, so let's talk a little bit about biogeography and bird distribution in the Antelope Valley. So here's two breeding distribution maps of two different bird species, which very well define the Antelope Valley. On the left, you see a species that essentially is everywhere, almost everywhere in the county, but avoids the Antelope Valley. And on the right, you see a bird that's widespread, at least in the eastern Antelope Valley, but is essentially not found or isn't found as a breeding bird anywhere else in the county, either in the mountains or on the coastal slope. So think for a second what birds these might be. And actually, there's several different species that would match both of these quite well. But in case you hadn't guessed it, these are California scrub jay and verdin. So hardly surprising. Scrub jay is a bird of oak woodland, chaparral, juniper woodland. So you can see they certainly get to the foothills and the southernmost flank of the Antelope Valley. But as breeding birds, they don't get farther out, and they're just rare wanderers farther out into the Antelope Valley. The verdin, on the other hand, is essentially restricted to the Antelope Valley, to desert habitats, Joshua trees, creosote scrub, ranch yards, and a few other things. This is LA County Breeding Bird Atlas data. If you look at eBird data, which we'll look at a little bit later, they're actually a little more widespread within the Antelope Valley than this. And there are some records of wanderers closer to the coastal slope, and in fact, even right to the immediate coast, but that's very rare there. So these two birds sum up very well the kind of negative and positive aspects of bird distribution in the Antelope Valley. So some of the familiar species, if you bird in the Antelope Valley, in the woodlands, both Joshua tree or Joshua tree mixed with junipers, even a little bit higher to some of the other conifers, is the Scott's oriole, which is our desert oriole. So these birds arrive in March. They're present and conspicuous through about July. They leave pretty early, so they get a bit hard to find starting in August. There are some winter records in the foothills on the south flank of the Antelope Valley, but by and large, then most of them migrate out of here. So it's a beautiful oriole with a beautiful fluty song. And I tell you, when you live where we do, it's just such a pleasure to have them in the yard and around singing and coming to the hummingbird feeders and so on. So Scott's oriole is certainly a signature bird of the Antelope Valley. This is a, well, I hesitate to say what it is. It's a ladderback woodpecker, or it's a mostly ladderback woodpecker. It's a female. I took this to be a ladderback, and it was calling like a ladderback, but the problem is we have sort of a hybrid zone between ladderback and Nuttall's woodpeckers in the area. So this bird has got maybe a little broader band of black on the uppermost back than a typical ladderback, but most of the other characters seem to fit pretty well, and it was calling like a ladderback, so we assume that's what it was. This was at a park in Palmdale. If you look at the breeding distributions, and again, this brings to mind what you saw for the scrub jay and the verdin, the Nuttall's woodpecker and the ladderback woodpecker are kind of almost like mirror images of each other in terms of their distribution. This is, again, Breeding Bird Atlas data. But the interesting thing is where these two essentially meet, if you look on this diagonal line on the southern flank of the Antelope Valley, they do hybridize regularly. And in fact, where we are in Juniper Hills, I see almost as many hybrids, not quite, but I see hybrids quite frequently where we have pure Nuttals and pure ladderbacks as well. Nuttals will sometimes get out into ranch yards out in the floor of the Antelope Valley, but their breeding distribution is pretty much limited to the southern flank and then up over the higher areas, whereas ladderbacks are essentially just limited to the valley floor and maybe up to about 3,500 feet on the southern flank of the valley. So there's a lot of this interesting like ranges that abut of closely related species between the Antelope Valley and the highlands and coastal slope area. Some birds are widespread pretty much everywhere. So this California quail you can find throughout the floor of the Antelope Valley, throughout the foothills, and of course, as you know, other than in heavily urbanized areas, also throughout the coastal slope. So you might think, okay, we're on the desert. The quail out here should be Gamble's quail, because that's the desert one, and the California quail is on the cooler in the valleys and the coastal slope and so on. But no, it's the California quail throughout the Antelope Valley. You have to go a fair ways farther northeast into San Bernardino County or way southeast into the lower deserts to get Gamble's quail. So the California quail is our desert quail here. Cactus wren's a really interesting bird throughout much of the Antelope Valley. It has declined in much of its range in the Antelope Valley, but still pretty common in native woodland, Joshua trees, junipers, creosotes with cholla. They like cholla cactus, but doing far better out here than on the coastal slope, where they're just a handful of populations, some of which are just barely hanging on. So this is a large desert wren that's much more familiar out here in the Antelope Valley than over on the coastal slope. This is certainly one of our most attractive sparrows, and Antelope Valley in general is just a fantastic place for sparrow variety, both breeding sparrows and migrant and wintering sparrows. This, of course, is the black-throated sparrow. It's the only member of the genus Amphispisa. It used to have some congeners, but they've all been moved off to other bird genera now. So this black-throated sparrow breeds again widely in sort of creosote scrub, especially with cholla, up into Joshua tree woodland and the lower limits of the junipers. They're around in winter, but they seem to be a little more localized. You'll run into flocks of them in the winter, but a lot of them seem to migrate out and leave this area in the winter, but you can find locally small flocks of them in the floor of the Antelope Valley through the wintertime as well. So we're returning to the verdin. Remember I showed you a map from that left-hand map from the breeding bird atlas data. And I just wanted to contrast that with eBird data. Remember that the breeding bird atlas was conducted for 5 years and part of a little bit of it in a 6th year, back from 1995 to 2000. And it was strictly looking at breeding birds. And really, once a species was confirmed in a block, there wasn't much additional effort to find it at additional sites. So if you look at the eBird data on the right, you can see the distribution is actually far more widespread in the Antelope Valley. Whether it is spread farther west or whether it just wasn't found during atlas efforts is a little hard to tell. I don't think their status has probably changed that much. But the map on the right is not just the breeding season, but all times of year. Now, verdins don't move much. They're resident species. On the other hand, they've obviously moved some because there are a number of records over into the Santa Clarita Valley, the San Fernando Valley, even into the San Gabriel Valley, and a record for the Palos Verdes Peninsula, which you can't see here off the bottom of the map. So we've got different ways of looking at bird distribution data, but in general, no matter how you look at it, the verdin is really a bird of the desert and the Antelope Valley. We've got a lot of newcomers too. If you live in the Antelope Valley, you're very familiar with Eurasian collared doves. They were not in California really until the 1990s and not really abundant until after about 2000 when they really started spreading. They're common in some areas on the coastal slope, but still a bit patchy, but they're very common and widespread through much of the Antelope Valley, basically wherever there are people. So in the towns, residential areas, ranch yards, and so on. And so this is a major change we've seen just in the last 20 to 25 years or so, is the abundance now of the Eurasian collared dove, which of course didn't even spread across North America until basically the 1980s and 1990s. And now it's almost everywhere in the New World. I don't know if there's an official valley bird of the Antelope Valley, but if there isn't, it probably ought to be the common raven. The common raven is everywhere. It's abundant. You see large flocks, sometimes in the many hundreds of birds, often up in the air, kettling and soaring. They're in every residential neighborhood, every agricultural field, out on the desert, up onto the slopes. And one way we often kind of have this running joke, how can you tell if somebody's a birder or not? And they're probably not a birder if they say, I live in the Antelope Valley and there's crows everywhere. Well, they're not crows, they're common ravens. There's a caveat to that because there are crows in the Antelope Valley, but the raven is the abundant one. And it's really, of course, does very well with human habitation, with human garbage, and they're increased, and also with the nest sites that we provide in planted trees and power poles and so on. And the increased abundance of raven has of course caused concern about the populations of things like desert tortoise and other sensitive species on the desert. So there's kind of pluses and minuses, but they're certainly interesting birds. So speaking of crows, again, if you come back to the breeding bird atlas map, it's pretty clear on the right that common ravens are everywhere. Even in the urban areas of LA on the coastal slope, they're now breeding more widely even than they were during the Atlas period. But if you look at the crow on the left, you can see it's essentially limited to the coastal slope and foothills with just a few spots out in the Antelope Valley. They are increasing in the Antelope Valley. If you live in the larger residential areas of Lancaster and Palmdale, you see crows quite regularly. And they do expand out a little bit into agricultural areas and other more spotty residential areas. But basically it's the ravens that are everywhere and the crows are very localized. And so one thing I'll talk a little bit about as we go through this is birds that are surprisingly scarce or absent in the Antelope Valley. And there always seem to be some birders who don't realize that, judging from their eBird lists. There's some really interesting variation in some species or related species. So the LA birders made quite an effort the last winter, and we maybe will ramp it up again this winter, to look for sagebrush sparrows wintering in the Antelope Valley. But the problem is they're extremely hard to tell from the very common bell sparrows, which are throughout the lower parts of the Antelope Valley in the Atroplex scrub and saltbush, and to a lesser extent in creosote. So in this picture on the lower right, the one that's a bit out of focus, is the bell sparrow. The bird faced away with, not surprisingly, a piece of trash. There is probably a sagebrush sparrow, but one of our problems is they're very hard to tell apart. And unless they're confirmed both from song and plumage, it's a little hard to be certain. But the very strong black streaking across the entire back, and although you can't tell from this photo, the very thin black mailer or whisker mark suggests this is probably a sagebrush sparrow. And the preliminary data say this is probably a very uncommon but expected winter bird in the Antelope Valley. It's a question of picking them out from these bell sparrows. A side note on bell sparrows is we've had the worst drought, one of the worst drought periods we've ever had in the last year or two. And this past winter out here was one of the driest on record. And that translated to virtually zero nesting success of bell sparrows this year. Most years you'll see family groups moving up into the foothills or even up into the mountains. They're all over. This year I didn't see a single juvenile, and only a few birders reported any juveniles. So I suspect that the lack of annual growth in seeds and insect prey probably caused them to largely fail in breeding this year. So when you're in the desert, you got to put up with a lot of variation in conditions, and some years are just not amenable to breeding. Now within the bell sparrow, it's also very interesting, because if you look northeast of the yellow line here, all those dots out there in the Antelope Valley are the Mojave Desert bell sparrows of the subspecies canescens. That's the pale one that looks very much like the sagebrush sparrow. But once you get into the foothills and the mountains, like you go just a little bit up into Acton and Aliso Canyon and the Angeles Forest Highway, Upper Big Tahunga, and then the mountains of the northwestern part of the county, you get the much darker nominate belli bell sparrows. So that's another fascinating thing about the Antelope Valley, is this area of either parapatry, meaning the ranges abut each other, or perhaps even sympatry. You might get at a single spot both of these subspecies breeding. That bears much more investigation along that yellow line, basically at about 3,000 feet or so along that southern flank of the Antelope Valley. So we don't know if these act as good species or not. We don't know what happens where they come together. We could also stand to better document differences in songs and things like this. So these are all things that birders that visit or are based in the Antelope Valley can help with. You can't talk about the Antelope Valley without talking about many, many environmental stressors that our bird life and other biodiversity faces. And so some of this is pretty obvious, and I don't want to be doom and gloom, and I'm only going to talk about this briefly, but you can't deny that there are some major issues. I assume Antelope Valley Audubon is very much involved in some of these, and all of you who bird the area should bear in mind that many of these things need much more attention and activism. But of course, the massive urban and suburban development, if you look at the Antelope Valley 50, 60 years ago, most of those huge housing tracts weren't there. In Lancaster and Palmdale, the population was much smaller. And every acre that's developed is an acre of habitat that's lost or replaced with very different habitat that's only suitable for a much smaller and less specialized subset of birds. Even if there is an ongoing building, I'm seeing a huge increase in just the people buying up land and scraping the soil. I don't know what they do, but in our area of Little Rock and Juniper Hills, people are buying up 5 acre tracts and just scraping them clean, even scraping Joshua trees that are protected by law. And once the desert soil is scraped, it doesn't recover, essentially, not within any reasonable period of time. So anything that grows there is going to either be planted by humans, or it's going to be basically an invasive weed. And the sad truth is there just isn't nearly enough protected habitat and Joshua tree woodlands, creosote scrub, and these other desert woodlands. There are, on the positive side, of course, some very important reserves, county wildlife areas, state parks, and so on. But there's an awful lot of important habitat that doesn't have that protection. Another ongoing thing, of course, is the lowering of the water table, pumping out for agriculture, for urban use, and so on. And this is exacerbated by increasingly frequent and severe dry years. So what that has resulted in over the years is a great reduction in the amount of irrigated agriculture in the Antelope Valley. Now, agriculture, of course, replaces native desert habitat too, but it also provides habitat for a lot of sensitive bird species. So think of long-billed curlews, mountain plovers, tricolored blackbirds, and others, all of which have either essentially disappeared from the Antelope Valley or at least have become very rare. And just, I might add as a side note, there's an increase in illegal agriculture too. Huge, you've read the LA Times recent article about marijuana grows, and I'm not passing any judgment one way or the other about marijuana, but certainly when you're scraping the land, applying illegal pesticides, stealing water and electricity, and so on, that's not very good for the environment. As we get into the foothill woodlands of the Antelope Valley, these increasingly frequent and unnatural fire regimes are really playing havoc with juniper woodland, which essentially does not recover from fire, nor does pinyon woodland, and Joshua tree woodlands, which if they recover, it's very, very slowly. So fire regimes are another big problem, and even out on the desert scrub as well. The next one's kind of a tricky one because you see huge acreage of the Antelope Valley that's taken over to renewable energy development, whether it's solar panels or wind farms on the foothills, especially the northern flank. You know, that's good, of course, for many reasons, but as you all know, renewable energy isn't without severe environmental costs as well in terms of direct impact on habitat, mining for rare metals, and so on. And so the only real solution is just to use a lot less energy, hopefully used by a lot fewer of us, but you don't hear that talked about much. And then there's just all the other insults to even existing habitat, like off-road widely through the Antelope Valley, illegal dumping everywhere. Maybe that can't directly harm a lot of birds, but it sure looks awful, and it introduces stuff into the environment that's obviously not good for wildlife. And it's just absolutely rampant out here. So here's an example of what's probably not very good desert bird habitat anymore. This is just one area. You can multiply this probably by 100 of dense housing developments. This is in southeastern Palmdale. And it's not birdless by any means, but it's certainly a great modification of the existing habitat. And the birds that do survive here are very adaptable ones rather than very specialized desert birds. And as I mentioned before, this kind of scraping is just going on and on and on. And I'm not sure what people do with these lands. I know one such area recently was planted as a vineyard, but a lot of them, they're just scraped and fenced and then nothing seems to happen. So it's almost like, well, we got to get rid of this ugly desert habitat and show some dirt instead. And of course, this dirt is very emissive when the wind blows. And if you don't live out here, maybe you don't know it. If you do live out here, you certainly do know that the wind blows. It usually blows out of the west, and it blows most of the time, and it can blow very hard. So there's a lot of dust that comes from these kinds of scrapings. And as I mentioned, of course, then fires. Now, of course, fire is very natural in many habitats, but it's also very destructive in certain things like Joshua tree woodland. So this is actually, this upper photo is taken about less than 500 yards from my house, and it just doesn't look nearly as good as it did before the bobcat fire, nor does it have birds. Even the riparian areas, that's Big Rock Creek on the right, where large stretches of riparian burned in the bobcat fire. That's a little more resilient because many of these same trees are now sprouting from the base, and even in like 1 year, some of that growth is now 10, 20 feet high. So that habitat will largely recover, but Joshua tree woodland, juniper woodland essentially does not recover. As I mentioned, of course, illegal dumping. I could have found much worse pictures than this, but this was in a beautiful riparian habitat along Little Rock Creek. And not only is stuff dumped everywhere in there, but they've even people camp illegally and set fire. So this little stretch of riparian down on the lower right was actually burned, a little spot fire, and it makes you a bit concerned about a very nice riparian habitat. So just some other notes about the Antelope Valley. It's a great place for raptors. A lot of the winter birding concentrates on looking for raptors. So we get ferruginous hawks every winter. In a good day, you can see half a dozen ferruginous hawks, sometimes more, in the Antelope Valley, largely in agricultural areas. Occasionally in winter, there'll be rough-legged hawks. White-tailed kites are erratic, some more some years than others, but they're in some of the ag areas and Paiute ponds. Golden eagles move in primarily in the winter time. Harriers can be very common and they breed at Paiute ponds. Short-eared owls come in some winters in very small numbers, but it's another really interesting raptor. I could add long-eared owl too, which roosts in certain areas in the wintertime in the Antelope Valley and breeds very locally. And then in the summertime, we get Swainson's hawks. There's still a handful of pairs that breed in the Antelope Valley. And of course, on a good day in migration, you might see a good-sized flock of them coming over. Out here, probably largely in March, maybe into early April. On the coastal slope, they can be even earlier. And then there can be some spectacular migrations of turkey vultures involving hundreds of birds moving through in spring. And again, about this time of year in October in the fall. So just a great place for raptors. Just as an example, on the left here is a prairie falcon. I know a purist photographer doesn't like birds on artificial structures like poles, but this is where you see prairie falcons perched most of the time. I know Mark Shield just photographed one the other day that had a bird in its talons that it had caught out in the agricultural fields in east of Lancaster, and it turned out to be a poorwill, which seems like an odd prey item for a prairie falcon out in the middle of the floor of the Antelope Valley. And on the right is a ferruginous hawk, which again can be widespread and not that hard to find in agricultural areas of the Antelope Valley and some of the grasslands along the slopes. I can't recall where I photographed this one, but I know I saw one the other day in that little agricultural field right next to the Palermo post office. So even up in the foothills, sometimes you'll see ferruginous hawks. So just a great place for raptors. And then there are other signature birds in the Antelope Valley. Horned larks can be very abundant. They breed, at least after good rain years, quite commonly in the floor of the Antelope Valley. They can gather into huge flocks in dirt fields, agricultural fields, mown fields, and so on. I know for many years, I think the Antelope Valley Christmas count led the entire North American continent in the high count of horned larks. There may not be quite as many as there were 20, 30 years ago when they led those high counts, but there's still lots of horned larks. And as most birders know at this time of year, now on in through early winter, if you find a big flock of horned larks and you're patient enough, you might pick out some longspurs in them. So we've had 3 species of longspurs some years in the Antelope Valley. Lapland is one just the other day, and we've had thick-billed and chestnut-collared longspurs as well. You have to be pretty patient and look hard, but if you get the right conditions, you can often find longspurs in with the horned larks. Now, way back when we were kind of rogue birders in the late 70s and early 80s, and private property wasn't such a huge thing, you could tromp through a lot of these fields and kick up the birds and find longspurs in there. Now you pretty much have to look from the edges from the roads and just hope they're close enough to find. And sorry, not a very good picture, but at least it shows you how hard they can be to spot. This is one of the signature wintering birds of the Antelope Valley, but unfortunately now awfully rare, the mountain plover. And we've had flocks sometimes of many hundred mountain plovers in various parts of the Antelope Valley, but there seem to be fewer and fewer every winter. Last winter, there was a decent sized, well, small flock, but stuck around for a long time over near the sod fields on 50th Street East around Avenue N. They can be up northeast of there in the valley in agricultural areas, but this is a bird that's greatly declining throughout its range, declined on the breeding grounds. The huge Imperial Valley wintering population seems to have crashed, and there are very few there now in winter. So this is a bird of real conservation concern, and certainly one that's going to need protection. And one reason why we want to maintain certain kinds of agriculture rather than replacing it with either dried out, fallowed, disturbed desert or with housing tracts. So the mountain plover. So if you live in the Antelope Valley, the towhee is not a familiar backyard bird in most areas. So the California towhee will have a distribution an awful lot like the scrub jay that I showed you before. It's going to be pretty much everywhere in the county except the Antelope Valley. Now they do make it a little ways onto the southern flank of the Antelope Valley. I've seen them as far out into the Antelope Valley as Lake Los Angeles, but pretty much it's not a desert bird. So it's really interesting. If you were to see a California towhee at, a place like Apollo Park or Paiute Ponds, that would be a real red letter day because you wouldn't expect that at all. And it's not migratory, so you don't expect them to move much. The spotted towhee, on the other hand, is migratory. So they breed commonly in the woodlands up, 3,500, 4,000, 5,000 feet on the flank of the Antelope Valley in oak woodland, pinyon juniper, riparian, and so on. But they don't breed in the floor of the Antelope Valley at all. But the interesting thing is, if you live in an area where there's a lot of spotted towhees year round, you don't think of their migration. But if you bird in the Antelope Valley, you really can start to look at things like migration dates of birds like spotted towhees, because on the floor of the valley, you pretty much only see them as a migrant and occasionally a scarce wintering bird. So you can kind of see when they move through in the spring and when they arrive in the fall. I had a bird in Lake Los Angeles this early June, which seemed really kind of out of place at that late, date. But that's one of the interesting things about the Antelope Valley is you see comings and goings of birds that may be year round in other parts of the county, so you don't think about their migrations. But out here, they're not so abundant year round, and you see their migrations. Here's another good example. This is a song sparrow, which is not a desert bird. So you don't see song sparrows. They don't breed in the floor of the Antelope Valley except around some wetland areas. So for example, at Paiute Ponds, song sparrow is a very abundant breeding bird because it's a huge wetland with a lot of brush and reeds. And there's some smaller wetlands that have song sparrows too, Lake Palmdale, many other areas. But they're not in the desert habitats. However, we get migrant song sparrows that come through. So again, if you live in an area that's got a lot of song sparrows year round, you don't think about their migrations. But out here, you can kind of see when they migrate through in little desert, pocket parks and oases and ranch yards and things. And another reason we know they migrate is you get song sparrows that look like this, which is not our breeding subspecies, which is Hirmani, which has much darker streaks below. But this bird with the reddish crown streaks, the reddish mailers and streaking below, is the subspecies Montana, which is migratory and spends the winter here, or you'll get a few migrants. So this one was at Lake Palmdale. You see them around in small numbers. So this is a migratory song sparrow that we generally don't see over on the coastal slope. So just another fascinating little difference of birding out here. And then there's a whole list of birds that you should never claim to see in the Antelope Valley unless you're really, really sure, because they're basically not here. Now, there are exceptions. So for example, the Allen's hummingbird, which, as you probably know, has spread like wildfire throughout the coastal slope, originally was the non-migratory subspecies, was limited to the Channel Islands, but now they're pretty much everywhere on the coastal slope. They're still expanding, and they have very recently expanded. I know a few people listening tonight involved with Antelope Valley Audubon have them in their yards. Not very many, maybe one or two or a few in Palmdale or Quartz Hill or places like that, even up as far as Rosamond. But it's still a very rare bird out here. We've had them at our feeders here in Juniper Hills, I think twice in the very early spring. So the Rufous hummingbird, on the other hand, is a very common migrant through the Antelope Valley. So you kind of have to learn these fine points of distribution. So we do know there are the Allen's hummingbirds that are beginning to get established out here. And that's a great thing to keep track of. Likewise, the western gull. This is the abundant gull of the saltwater areas on the ocean of LA County. And they feed commonly inland through the urban areas. They can be common inland to some of the reservoirs like Castaic Lake and other areas, but they don't get to the desert slope, at least don't normally. So there's very few, there's only a couple of documented records of western gull in the Antelope Valley, a couple of Paiute Ponds, maybe one or two elsewhere. So we get tons of California gulls. They're all through Lancaster and Palmdale in the winter. You get migrant ring-billed gulls and even occasionally, Franklin's gulls and other things. But the western gull is a super rarity out here. And so if you think you see one, please document it. This one I photographed on the coastal slope, but I did manage to photograph one at Paiute Ponds earlier this year. I know John Bersner and I were able to see that bird. So it's a rare bird. So you just have to learn these quirks of distribution. Things like Cassin's kingbird, which is so common on much of the coastal slope, is a rare bird on the floor of the Antelope Valley. You get a few of them in the foothills around like Little Rock and some other areas, but it's not expected to be seen way out in the floor of the Antelope Valley or in the agricultural areas where we have lots at the right time of year. We have a lot of western kingbirds. So keep in mind all these little sort of anomalies. I'm not going to go through a whole bunch of pictures of rarities that have been found, but just to kind of whet your appetite. This is way out of date, but as of 2004, which is the data for the California, the Rare Birds of California book by the California Bird Records Committee, there are at least 32 records of rarities accepted by the committee from the Antelope Valley. Not all of these are on the CBRC list, but just the partial list would be things like trumpeter swan from Paiute, tufted duck, used to be at least on Quail Lake and some of the reservoirs on the west end. Barrow's goldeneye is not a CBRC review species, but it's a very rare bird in Southern California. The last few years have been one or two along the aqueduct in the, basically in the Little Rock area, and they've been seen at Quail Lake as well. We've had some really rare shorebirds, upland sandpiper, Hudsonian godwit, curlew, white rump, sharptail, both little and redneck stint, and the first and still only accepted California record of gray-tailed tattler was from the Lancaster sewage ponds way back in 1983, I believe, 1981, 81 or 83, I forget. Anyway, it was a long time ago. And so we've had some really good birds. And just in terms of land birds, some interesting things. The only documented county record of Woodhouse's scrub jay, which is sort of a Great Basin equivalent of the California scrub jay, was at a ranch yard in the northern Antelope Valley. We've had rare northerners like northern shrike. One year there was 100+ Bohemian waxwings but at Valyermo, between the fire station there and Big Rock Creek and Bob's Gap Road. Sprague's pipit, there was a winter when there were several of them out in alfalfa fields east of Lancaster. We've had Cassin sparrows singing in spring. Nelson sparrow, a real rarity as a migrant anywhere away from the coast. One at Paiute Ponds a few years ago. Blue-winged warbler, there was one at Lake Palmdale. One of only a couple county records of Pyrrholoxia was from a ranch yard called Linda Mia Ranch out by Wilsona Gardens, north of Lake Los Angeles. And it's a ranch that doesn't exist anymore. It was a beautiful ranch with weeping willows around a pond and huge cottonwoods. But that's a byproduct of the greater expense of water and the loss of the water table, is that ranch is basically now dust and sand and a couple trunks of dead trees, and there's not a bird within sight. So just a couple of the scarcer birds you might not see on every birding trip in the Antelope Valley. Upper left is a trumpeter swan that was at Paiute Ponds. In the upper right, Lapland longspur. This one was actually in San Diego, but the ones that show up look a lot like this. I know Mark Scheel had one, and I think Chris Dean saw it again a day later up by the sod farms or up by Avenue L and 50th East just a couple days ago. I went today. I didn't see it, but it might have been there somewhere. On the lower left is a red-throated pipit that made a showing in the fall of 2019 at Sorensen Park in Lake Los Angeles. A very cooperative bird for a couple days. And on the lower right is a Asiatic or an old world shorebird called the little stint that was at Paiute Pond. So one of the rarer shorebirds that's turned up at Paiute Pond. So one of the great things about desert birding is when you do get a patch of habitat with water and with greenery, it can be a magnet for migrants, and any magnet for migrants can be a great place to find unusual birds too. So the longspur, of course, was in a ag field with horned larks, but the others was at a great wetland like the trumpeter swan and the little stint, or just a irrigated athletic fields in a park in Lake Los Angeles. And of course, as I mentioned, Barrow's goldeneyes have shown up the last 2 or 3 winters along the aqueduct. And I know several birders headed up by John Feenster have done a bird survey every winter, midwinter of the aqueducts, all the way from the west end of the Antelope Valley to into San Bernardino County. And it's amazing cumulatively the number of ducks and other water birds that use the aqueduct. You know, you think of lakes where you can see everything at once, and the aqueduct's only 50 feet wide or whatever, but it's also dozens and dozens of miles long. So it's like one of the largest lakes in the county if you look at the surface area of the water, and it gets an amazing number of birds and seems to be the best place to find Barrow's goldeneye in the county. And of course, it's a great place to study ducks. If you don't go birding anywhere else in the Antelope Valley, go to Apollo Park and you can see waterfowl to your heart's content. They may all be 1 or 2 species of domestics, but the variety is phenomenal. So these are just a couple very odd mallard breeds on the left and a couple answer geese that are either mostly or entirely swan geese, which is a domesticated old world goose. But the neat thing about Apollo Park is you get some native geese that come in and settle in there. Like there's some snow geese, there's a greater white-fronted goose. Lots of Canada geese are now resident there. Occasionally a Ross's goose and so on. And some land birds and some other water birds. So like any patch of green with water in the Antelope Valley, it's certainly well worth visiting. But you do have to suffer through this bizarre batch of weird looking domestic waterfowl. Bird life is always changing here. This is a vermilion flycatcher, a couple different males from the Antelope Valley, and that's a juvenile in the upper right at Pear Blossom Park a year ago. They bred there for a couple years, although not this year. And this is a bird that has expanded its range. It's now been seen in many different parts of the Antelope Valley. There's birds I know currently at Crystal Air and at the Rancho Sierra Golf Club and probably other parts of the Antelope Valley. During the Breeding Bird Atlas work at the end of the 1990s, the only county, the first and only county breeding record was up in the Leona Valley, just south of the Antelope, the western part of the Antelope Valley. But since then, they've bred in several other areas. So what used to be considered a super rarity is now a bird you can very often find in the Antelope Valley, and quite a treat when you do see them. So I just wanted to end, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'm sorry I started so late, but if we've got time, I'm very happy to answer questions. But I wanted to end with kind of a plea for all of you to become involved or continue to be involved in community science and having your observations go into large databases that really help scientific research. So this is a map of what are known as hotspots in eBird. So these are areas that are shared areas where anybody can submit a list from those areas. There are, of course, a million other personal localities for people that they enter eBird data from. But if you look at the Antelope Valley there, you can see the hotspots aren't quite as dense as they are in the LA Basin. Not very surprising. There are a lot fewer people out here. But you also see, if you see this kind of big gap between Lake Los Angeles and Lancaster Palmdale, and some other gaps in the easternmost part of the county, and gaps along the Sierra Pelona and some of the mountain ranges here. Some of these areas aren't that easy to get to in the mountains, but out here you can get anywhere. It just suggests to us that there's more places to explore. And of course, there's 2 ways you can help fill out data. One is by going to places that aren't already covered as hotspots and birding them and creating new hotspots, so more birders will add data. The other one, though, is to pick any of these hotspots and look at the bar graphs of what's been seen through the year, and you'll see lots of gaps where there's been no coverage. So try covering it at a time of year when nobody else has been there. You'll really help fill in data. So, there are exceptions, like Paiute Ponds. There's probably, 10 birders a day and 50 birders a week who are there covering it throughout the year. But many of these other hotspots, especially the ones in the blues with fewer species, probably have only been covered a handful of times through the year and could use coverage. Maybe through the winter there's nothing, or maybe in the summer breeding season there's no coverage. So take a look at these hotspots and kind of plan, instead of going to where somebody's just found a rare bird and being the 127th person to look at it, go find a place where nobody's gone at a time of year where they haven't been there. contribute some data. So eBird's a great way to do that. And then, you know, here's just an example. Paiute Ponds is probably one of the best covered areas in the county. So there's no gaps. There's data from every single, you know, 1 week period throughout the year. And you can just see, you really look at migration dates. If you come down a few species, you can see, for example, Dunlin are there through the winter, and then you see when they disappear at spring. They don't arrive in fall till September, whereas the Baird's is primarily an early fall migrant, July through September. Very similar for pectoral sandpiper, far fewer in spring. You can see big peaks of migration of western sandpipers down here. Short-billed dowitcher having distinct migration peaks and much less common than the long-billed dowitcher, which you can see almost every week of the year. And then you see a lot of the rarities too, you know, the little one record of a curlew sandpiper and a redneck stint, the one little stint, you know, just a couple records of white rump sandpiper and so on. So this is a place with great data, but I wish every place had data like this. On the other hand, you know, if I had the choice between birding at Paiute Ponds and going to a patch of dust and bare dirt and creosote scrub that has never been covered through the entire fall or something, I guess I'd probably go to Paiute Ponds instead, but there's a lot we can contribute. And there's another great community science database, which is iNaturalist. These are records, individual records supported by photographs, and then identifications are made by community experts. And so you don't even have to know what you're photographing. You know, if you say, oh, there's a squirrel in the tree, I have no idea what it was, upload the photo and somebody, I guarantee you, will identify it and someone else will confirm the identification. So I just picked the eastern fox squirrel as an example because it's really interesting. They are at some of the parks in the Antelope Valley. In fact, if you look at the map down here, you see a few dots in here. And yet, I imagine they must be much more widespread than what you see on the iNaturalist map. So if you look more closely at the map, I know that most of these dots are my own observations, which is not, so in other words, instead of saying that fox squirrels are really rare and localized and there are hardly any of them in the Antelope Valley, I think it mostly says I'm about the only person who ever enters fox squirrel sightings into iNaturalist. So if you live out here and you've got squirrels, please enter the data because we can really fill out, you know, this information. Recently, there have been fox squirrels, for example, at it's off the map here down to the right, but in Pear Blossom Park. I'd never seen them there before. How did they get there? Did they scamper, you know, 10 miles down the Highway 138 or cross all that desert? Did somebody who was sick of them in their yard in Palmdale trap it and let it go in Pear Blossom? Or did somebody say, hey, I've got a lot of fox squirrels here and I love them and I think Pear Blossom deserves to have some too. We don't know how these things are happening, but the way to begin to find out is to map where they are. So whether you live in the Antelope Valley or just visit, enter sightings of mammals, of reptiles, insects, plants, anything into iNaturalist because it's really used very heavily by researchers. And we've got a whole project looking at fox squirrel distribution around Los Angeles, especially vis-a-vis the distribution of the native gray squirrel. But you can see just how little data has been entered from the Antelope Valley. And I know they're more widespread. This big blue pin here is Lancaster City Park, or Stephen Owen Park, right next to the Costco there. And they're all over the place. There's dozens of fox squirrels in there. And I think I'm the only one who's ever entered any data for them there. So you guys can all do that too. So I urge you to get more involved with these citizen community science databases, eBird, iNaturalist, and really help round out our understanding of biogeography out here. And with that, I know I've just touched on a handful of subjects, but I'm really happy to answer questions, anything you have about bird life or conservation issues or anything else in the Antelope Valley. So thanks for your patience with my glitches trying to join the meeting, and I appreciate all of you being here and happy to answer questions. I guess I can stop sharing now.
Well, this is Danielle Fowler. I was monitoring the chat, although I did have a technical difficulty where I was booted off myself. So I don't see any questions in the chat, but there could be questions in the chat because I got booted off. So I just wanted to let people know if they did type them in, would you please retype, because I had some technical difficulties on my side. And we have some, from Charles Hood, who's commenting that they're Fark squirrels on AV college campus and just never had a camera. Will post it eventually. That's a very good observation. Thank you.
And I would add that, yes, you probably do have a camera if you have a cell phone. That's the thing about iNaturalist is everybody over the age of 2 has a camera with them everywhere they go these days. And that's part of the beauty of iNaturalist. It doesn't have to be a publishable quality photograph. It just has to document the identity. So thanks those who have entered data on these squirrels. I know more of you than just me have done so, but yeah, people have cameras with them all the time now. Charles, you ought to get a cell phone.
And we have a remark from Bettina. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Do you suppose the folks are buying up the land and scraping it so that the agencies can't prevent them from developing it if there is no longer anything there? That's a very interesting question. What are your thoughts, Kimball?
Well, they're only thoughts because I don't know, but Bettina, I certainly agree that happens. I mean, we know that prior to various species being listed, there's often a great rush to make sure you get rid of them all before they're listed so you don't have to worry about preserving them. A lot of the areas that have been scraped they leave the Joshua trees. But what you're doing is you're leaving Joshua trees, which you're required to do by law, but you're still destroying Joshua tree habitat. The habitat isn't just that one species of tree, it's everything else as well. But some of the other scrapes I've seen have mowed down the Joshuas as well. So yeah, I don't know if it's, it's private property. It may be perfectly legitimate. Maybe they're going to build a house, but I don't see a lot of building going on. I just see scraping, and we'll see. But again, the bottom line is we just need more acreages or more square miles of protected land, because you can't just have little, postage stamp preserves here and there that aren't connected by habitat. You really need a whole system of large and connected reserves, and I don't see that happening with desert habitat out here. And I know we can raise our voices and maybe not much will happen, but I think it can be better than what we've seen.
We have
There's another question from Chris Floyd, where he wants to know what the status of LeConte's thrasher is. Avenue Q is where he got it. He has seen it.
Yeah, LeConte's thrasher is another. If I had a better photo, I would have put one in the program. But they're certainly still in the Antelope Valley and fairly widespread, primarily in the eastern and the lowest parts of the Antelope Valley. But they've disappeared from many areas where we used to find them regularly, like 145th East and Q used to be a great place. They're not there anymore. They're the low scrub surrounding Paiute ponds. There are actually a fair number of them scattered around the far northeastern part of the county in the eastern Antelope Valley, in habitat that people don't spend a lot of time in, but it is a declining bird and they don't tolerate development at all, and they probably don't tolerate fragmentation of their habitat as well. So, I mean, I think that's something we could stand to do, is survey for LeConte's thrashers and just see how they are faring, because we don't know other than we know they're declining.
All right, I don't see any more questions. Do you, Danielle? One person asked, is this being recorded? It is, and one of our board members edits and posts. So I'm just not sure. It'll be on our website when we finish editing it.
Yes.
Okay, well, thanks
put it up on the website as well. And I want to say thank you so very much, Kimball, for coming here. Many of us are very grateful. I personally live in Lake Los Angeles, and I am so happy that you have made it your mission to really go all over the Antelope Valley and really do some wonderful birding and get some wonderful checklists up there on eBird. And I have to agree with you. Get as many checklists as you can possibly get out there. And then the other thing I can encourage people to do is in their own area. I know many people are not from the Antelope Valley, but also in your own area, when it comes time for Climate Watch, claim a square and do the Climate Watch. That is another important part of citizen science, because that's how we're going to conserve the birds, is we need data. We can't just go out there and say, oh, well, the bird population's dwindling or this is happening. We need actual scientific data to back up our claims so that we have a leg to stand on when we go against these companies that are trying to do different things that we're not appreciative of. So I want to thank you so very much. And I know many people have been saying thank you in the chat, so we greatly appreciate it.
My pleasure. Again, I apologize for the delay at the beginning. Not quite sure what happened, but I hope I didn't keep you too late and cause you to miss too much of the Dodgers, maybe last game of the year or whatever. I don't even know what's happening, but anyway, thank you for the opportunity, and we'll see you out birding in the Antelope Valley.
Thank you so
Thanks
very
a lot,
much.
everybody.
I'm going to stop the recording and